The man known to history as Frank Herbert was born on the 8th of October 1920 as Franklin Patrick Herbert Jr. in Tacoma, Washington, located in the Pacific Northwest region of the United States. Frank would drop Jr. from his name later in his life. His father was Frank Patrick Herbert Sr. Herbert Sr. worked variously as a motorcycle patrolman, an electrical equipment salesman, and the operator of a bus line. Herbert Sr.'s parents moved to Washington in the early 1900s during the period in which some scholars would later claim was the closing of the American West. The Herbert family was a little odd, having come to Washington to live in a utopian community which had been established there in the 1890s. The Herberts would never quite lose their affinity for esoteric thought. Frank's mother was Eileen Marie McCarthy, a woman of Irish descent from Wisconsin. Frank's early years were eccentric, given his father's mixed career paths and also the wider family's unusual activities. Family law has held that while Frank was a child in the 1920s, the Herberts operated a speakeasy called the Spanish Castle Ballroom off Highway 99 between their native Tacoma and the city of Seattle during the era of American Prohibition. If this is true, then the Herberts were responsible for running one of Washington State's most well-known illegal bars during Prohibition. While his family perhaps ran a speakeasy, Frank himself was developing into a precocious reader during these years. By the age of 5, he was an avid reader of the local newspapers and also displayed the wide-ranging interests which would come to characterize his later work and the multifaceted nature of the science fiction world he created. For instance, as a child, he took an interest in photography, buying a Kodak box camera when he was just 10 years old, while also developing a fondness for outdoors activities such as camping, fishing, and hunting. But it was also a troubled childhood in some respects. Frank's parents were binge drinkers, and often he had to care for his younger sister, Patty Lou, who was considerably younger than him, having been born in the early 1930s. Herbert's troubled home life, which was compounded by poverty in the 1930s as the Great Depression wreaked havoc across the United States and the Western world, led him to leave high school in Washington early and to leave his home state to go and live with his aunt and uncle in Salem, Oregon. There he enrolled in North Salem High School and completed his secondary education before acquiring a job in 1939 with the Glendale Star, a local newspaper. This was in line with the interests Herbert had developed back in Washington, where he had begun writing for the school newspaper, though he had to lie about his age to get the job and attended the interview in Oregon smoking a pipe to make himself look older than he was. It was the beginning of many years of working for newspapers, a job which doubtlessly honed his writing abilities while also providing a solid income in the 1940s and 1950s while he wrote science fiction in his spare time. By 1940, he had acquired a position with the Oregon Statesman, doubling as a photographer and a writer. Shortly after he joined the Oregon Statesman, Herbert met Flora Lillian Parkinson while visiting San Pedro in California in 1941. They were married a short time later after driving overnight to Herbert's native Tacoma and having the ceremony carried out before a night judge. They soon had a daughter named Penelope, who was born in 1942, and the suspicion is that theirs was a shotgun wedding when Flora realized she was pregnant. She was, though, the only child they would have. Flora soon vanished with Penelope, and her mother would not tell Herbert where they had gone. Eventually, he petitioned for a divorce and received the same in 1943, with Flora retaining majority custody of their daughter. It may have also been during the early 1940s that Herbert first experimented with drugs, such as cannabis and psilocybin mushrooms. These later influenced his depiction of the concept of prescience, as conferred by consumption of the spice mélange in the world of Dune. Perhaps why Herbert's first marriage broke up as quickly as it did was owing to his absence on military service. In the autumn of 1939, the Second World War had broken out in Europe after Nazi Germany invaded Poland, leading Britain and France to in turn declare war on the Nazis. The United States avoided becoming directly embroiled in the conflict in its early years, but had provided extensive covert aid to Britain in the shape of arms and financing, particularly so after France fell to the Germans in the summer of 1940. Despite domestic resistance to becoming more involved in what many saw as a European war, the US was dragged into the conflict in December 1941 when the Empire of Japan, Germany's Asian ally, attacked the US Pacific Fleet at anchor in Pearl Harbor in the Hawaiian Islands. Outraged and spurred on by Franklin D. Roosevelt's efforts, Americans mobilized across the country to aid the Allies. Initially, Herbert was drafted into the Seabees with the U.S. Navy, where his skills as a photographer were employed at a naval base in Virginia. There, he suffered a head injury after tripping on a tent tie and was given an honorable discharge in 1943. Consequently, he spent the remaining 2 years of the war back in Oregon, where he obtained a new post as a reporter with the Oregon Journal. In the aftermath of the Second World War, Herbert returned to his native Washington and began a course at the University of Washington on creative writing. It was the first major sign that he intended to embark on a career as a fiction writer rather than committing wholly to journalism. He did so on the GI Bill, which allowed veterans of the war from poorer backgrounds to attend universities across the United States and which became a driving force of American post-war prosperity through the 1960s. Herbert, always a precocious individual, had already acquired his first paid publishing contracts by 1946, when a story of his was accepted by Doc Savage magazine. As a result, he decided to quit the University of Washington before he finished his degree and courses. Still, his time there was not wholly unproductive. While there, he had met Beverly Stewart Forbes, who was taking the same class as him. He was smitten, and they began seeing each other, quickly marrying in the summer of 1946. They would go on to have 2 sons, Brian, born in 1947, and Bruce, born in 1951, and remained happily married for nearly 40 years. Brian would eventually become his father's intellectual successor of sorts, acting as custodian of the Dune estate and the fictional world his father created for decades to come. Herbert's relationship with his youngest, however, was far more complicated, owing to his son being gay. Frank struggled to accept this aspect of his child's life, which led to a lifelong estrangement. The Herbert family moved to California at the end of the 1940s to work for the Press Democrat in Santa Rosa. Frank did not remain there long and continued to have a fairly itinerant writing career, often moving from publication to publication. But he was talented enough that he was never unemployed for long, always finding work when he needed it. In the early 1950s, he even became a political speechwriter, while a growing list of publications of his own work added to the family income. But it was still a precarious life. When Beverly's mother gave the family a piece of land on Vashon Island in Puget Sound in Washington, they began building a house here, but ran out of money before it was finished, leading the bank to take the house and partial ownership of the land too. It was this which led them to head south to California, where they developed habits which were eccentric by the standards of the time. The couple spent much time with Irene and Ralph Slattery, a pair of Jungian psychologists, while Frank grew out his beard and began taking an interest in Zen Buddhism. As his son Brian would later recount, Frank was a beatnik before they came into vogue. It was also during these years that Herbert firmly set himself to writing in the science fiction genre. Science fiction is, in many ways, a very old genre, and one could argue that ancient tales of fantastical travels by individuals with abnormal powers are the precursor of the genre, extending all the way back as far as Sumerian, Egyptian, and Greek mythology. For instance, as early as the 2nd century AD, the Greco-Roman author Luciano di Samosata presented a story of an individual travelling through outer space in his True History and meeting non-human life forms. There are many of the themes which have characterized the genre in modern times already on display here in Lucian's work, notably the concept of advanced civilizations, interplanetary warfare, and societies capable of doing things which humans can only conjecture at. Lucian's work was ultimately a piece of satire, and while many stories followed in medieval and early modern times in this vein, science fiction in its modern form is really a product of the second half of the 19th and first half of the 20th centuries. This came about owing to the rapid technological developments pursuant from the Industrial Revolution. A landmark was Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, published in 1818, which explores the problems which human technological development could bring about in the guise of a science fiction horror story. Later in the century, authors like Jules Verne and H.G. Wells produced canonical works in the genre, such as 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and The War of the Worlds, while by the 1920s and 1930s, the genre was advanced enough that it gave birth to the Pulp magazine, which featured serialized science fiction stories. Herbert grew up on these, and in his youth in Tacoma and then in Oregon, he would have read stories by prominent science fiction authors of the time, such as Olaf Stapledon and John W. Campbell, while he was also seemingly influenced by the Russian author Yevgeny Zamyatin's We, published in the early 1920s, and comprising a commentary on the nature of totalitarianism that would also go on to influence writers like George Orwell and Aldous Huxley. By the 1940s and 1950s, as Herbert entered his adult years and began to truly commit to science fiction writing, the genre was coming into a golden age, as writers like Arthur C. Clarke, Frederick Pohl, L. Sprague de Camp, and Isaac Asimov began publishing extensively. It was into this field that Herbert threw himself in the post-war years. Dune was the work which Herbert would eventually become known for, but it was not the first science fiction world he built up, nor what he was preoccupied with in his earlier writing years. Instead, he primarily started out writing short stories in the second half of the 1940s and developed his skills in the process, finding publishers for some of these works in magazines like Fantastic Universe and Amazing. These early stories explored various science fiction worlds, some being entirely distinct from Earth, and some being based on alternate versions of our own world. An example of the latter, which garnered praise when it was published in the 1950s, was Cease Fire, a story set on Earth in 1972, where a low-level war is being fought against a mysterious alien entity in the far north of the North American continent, in the Arctic regions of Canada and Alaska. Herbert was soon expanding out his vision into novellas and books. For instance, in 1956, he published The Dragon in the Sea, a story focused on a battle for oil between the East and the West, two different powers in conflict with each other undersea. This science fiction world was created in the light of the Cold War between the US-dominated West and an eastern nexus of Communist China and the USSR. Thus, By the second half of the 1950s, Herbert was using science fiction to explore political and societal issues of America in the middle of the 20th century. Herbert began work on the Dune world and books around 1959. He was inspired to do so on the back of his experiences in the mid-1950s with the issue of floating or moving sand dunes on the Oregon coastline, which were causing environmental problems there, engulfing whole houses in some cases. Herbert actually chartered a plane to fly over the dunes in order to get a bird's-eye view of the problem. During these years, Herbert's general interest in and engagement with ecological issues increased considerably. He had also been taking a large amount of psilocybin mushrooms around this time and believed it stimulated his imagination. The result was the manuscript for Dune, the first book in the series produced in the early 1960s, one which his agent sold the first part of to Analog magazine in 1963, resulting in a $2,295 advance to continue writing. Owing to this, Herbert ploughed on with his work, and by the mid-1960s had written drafts of each of the first 3 books in the series: Dune, Dune Messiah, and Children of Dune. He imagined these should be published as a trilogy of novels all together in one book, but he would never be able to find a publisher who would agree to this. One facet of Herbert's first Dune book, which is seldom noted, is that he struggled enormously to get it published. He submitted Dune to 23 different publishers in the 1960s that all rejected it. But eventually he did manage to find a publisher, though a less than auspicious one in some respects. The publishing house which picked up Dune after more than 20 others had passed was Chilton Books, primarily known at the time for publishing manuals on repairing automobiles and other books on a range of engineering topics, and whose marquee publication was a magazine called Iron Age. This is maybe not as irregular a backstory for a successful book series as it first appears. Consider that J.K. Rowling, the author of the Harry Potter series and the creator of a multi-billion-dollar franchise today, had the manuscript for her first book in that series rejected by a dozen different publishing houses in the 1990s before Bloomsbury agreed to publish it. Other well-known works, which were initially rejected like Herbert's, include Ernest Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises, William Golding's The Lord of the Flies, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye. Perseverance was critical for Herbert as much as any other famous author. Despite its somewhat tortuous publication history, Dune was a success. It was instantly well received and tied with Roger Zelazny's The Immortal to win the Hugo Award in 1966. The Hugo Award is the marquee annual award for the best publication the previous year in either the fields of science fiction or fantasy writing. Herbert also became the first individual to win the Hugo and Nebula double, having been awarded the inaugural Nebula Award, an accolade which is also given out to one of the foremost works of science fiction and fantasy published the previous year. In winning both honours in 1966, Herbert set a precedent for esteemed works which would later include Larry Niven's Ringworld in 1971, Arthur C. Clarke's Rendezvous with Rama in 1974, Frederick Pohl's Gateway in 1978, and Neil Gaiman's American Gods in 2003. In each instance, the book in question was published the previous year or the year before that, and was awarded both the Hugo and Nebula after critical evaluations had come in. In the longer term, Dune would go on to become one of the best-selling novels of the 20th century and is believed to be the best-selling work of science fiction ever written. It has, for instance, been translated into over 20 languages and has sold over 20 million copies. placing it on a par with Mark Twain's The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn and George Orwell's Animal Farm. Consequently, Dune is unquestionably one of the foremost works of science fiction and fantasy ever written. Dune is set in an alternate universe where intergalactic travel is made possible by an organization called the Navigation Guild that uses a substance known as the spice melange to enter a state of limited prescience and thus successfully navigate ships through folded space. The universe is vast, though Herbert kept his exposition of the world involved limited in order to allow his readers to use their own imagination as to exactly how enormous it is. The perception conveyed is of thousands or tens of thousands of inhabited planetary systems. Yet these are united under the rule of an emperor, Shaddam IV, who controls the systems using his army of Sardaukar elite soldiers who live only to fight for the imperial government. Herbert would expand on other parts of the world in subsequent books, notably groups such as the Tleilaxu and Ix. However, in the first novel in the series, matters focused largely on two noble houses, those of the Harkonnen and the Atreides. The Harkonnen are a brutal, merciless people who hail from Gidi Prime, an inhospitable fire planet, while the Atreides are a much more honourable group who come from Caladan, a river planet. As the book commences, the Harkonnen are being removed from their position as custodians of Arrakis, the sand planet at the centre of the novels, which is the only source in the universe of the precious spice melange. They are to be replaced by the Atreides on the order of the Emperor, but exactly why the Emperor has chosen to remove the Harkonnen and what political scheming might be afoot is unclear. What is clear is that the Harkonnen and Atreides are two of the most powerful groups in the Empire, but are mortal enemies. The novel, and indeed Herbert's subsequent two Dune novels, Dune Messiah and Children of Dune, have Paul Atreides as the central character. Paul is the son and heir of Duke Leto, head of the House of Atreides. As the narrative begins, Paul is still on Caladan, preparing to depart for Arrakis. There he is trained by his sword masters and other tutors, men such as Duncan Idaho and Gurney Halleck. He also has a run-in with the Bene Gesserit early on, an organization of matriarchal seers who Paul's mother, Lady Jessica, had once been under the wing of. When they arrive on Arrakis, they soon learn more about the planet, which is effectively a vast sand sphere, hence the title Dune, in reference to sand dune. It is almost entirely lacking in civilization, and the only reason the Harkonnen and now the Atreides are there is to oversee the harvesting of the spice from the capital, Arrakeen. Apart from this, the planet was populated by the Fremen, a seemingly primitive group who live out on the sands, using water reclamation suits to retain any precious water which they can. More sinister are the sandworms, giant worms which course around Dune, destroying anything they come into contact with. That is except for the Fremen, who have learned to ride the sandworms when needed. There is immediate political chicanery when the Atreides install themselves on Caladan. They are double-crossed by the Harkonnen, who kill Paul's father, the Duke, and reclaim control of the government of Arrakis. Paul, however, escapes, along with his mother, and flees to the Fremen. There he spends many years becoming knowledgeable in their ways and learning everything there is to know about the planet, particularly the fact that the spice melange is produced by the sandworms. In the process, the Fremen also begin to recognize that he is a prophesied Messiah, who they have long waited for, as he has prescience which he has acquired from his mother's Bene Gesserit heritage. Later, he drinks the water of life, a substance which is believed to be fatal to males, but which he survives. After reconnecting with Gurney Halleck and learning of the situation with the Harkonnen and the Emperor, Paul and the Fremen ride sandworms to the capital of Arrakis and attack the Sardaukar and Harkonnen there. There, Paul kills Feyd-Rautha of the House of Harkonnen and informs the Emperor that he can destroy all of the spice production on Arrakis if he does not cede his throne to him. The Emperor, realizing he is out of options, does so, and gives Paul the hand of his daughter, Princess Irulan, in a marriage to cement the succession. The themes which are explored in Dune and in its sequels are numerous and quite complex. For starters, this is a book, or series of books, which are set within a science fiction setting, and so they follow some of the classic tropes of the genre. For instance, there is a young protagonist who rises from a position of some simplicity at the beginning to become the hero of the piece. There is a father figure who was killed early on, and there are wise, sage figures in the shape of the Bene Gesserit and Paul's mentors, Gurney Halleck and Duncan Idaho, though the degree to which the Bene Gesserit are a malevolent force is left deliberately unclear. Then there are the evil enemies in the shape of the Harkonnen, and Paul has to go through a process of maturation and growth before he can defeat them. This is all in line with a wide range of literature. For instance, the stories of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table in medieval times presented stock characters such as these, and they heavily influenced the science fiction genre in the 20th century. Indeed, Herbert did state on occasion that he was substantially influenced by the Arthurian legend. But Herbert also had his own unusual take on them, presenting Paul's journey as a process of enlightenment which would have consequences for the world around him and the Fremen in particular. As such, Herbert raises moral and philosophical questions through Paul's Odyssey about the nature of fate and destiny and whether or not human beings have free will. Much of this was based on Herbert's growing awareness of psychoanalysis and also 19th and 20th century European philosophy. The foremost theme of Dune, beyond Paul's own journey, is a concern with ecological matters. Arrakis is presented as a desolate, unlivable desert, one which is also prized for the spice mélange. The Fremen are the only ones who can survive out on the dunes, and this is only owing to their careful preservation of water supplies. All Fremen wear suits to preserve water, for instance, and spitting on the ground next to someone is considered a mark of respect, as one is shedding precious water in doing so. As the novel, and indeed the wider series, progresses, it becomes clear to Paul and others that Arrakis is actually capable of being changed ecologically, as there are water reserves or canals underground which the Fremen are able to exploit. The Fremen have been collecting water from these for generations with the goal of potentially terraforming parts of Arrakis into a greener environment and making it more hospitable. However, this runs contrary to the designs of almost all other powers in the universe. If Arrakis is terraformed, it will destroy the environment which the sandworms live in, and without them, the supply of the spice mélange, which sits on the surface of Arrakis and allows for space travel, will begin to dry up. Thus, Herbert's book offers a meditation on the nature of technological desire and ecological necessity, and how the two can clash with each other. This, more than most of the themes and ideas in Herbert's writings, is arguably the one which has resonated most over time, as we have become increasingly aware that humanity's technological progress can be at odds with the preservation of the planet and the maintenance of other forms of life on it. A wide range of other themes are also explored throughout Dune and its sequels. One is the nature of declining empires. The first book in the series explores the decline of both the Emperor and his House of Corrino and the House of Harkonnen, both bloated and ghastly through their materialism and excessive behavior, whereas House Atreides, and in particular the Fremen, present a counterpoint of a vital and active new force in the universe. In his characterizations, Herbert had the decline and fall of the Roman Empire in mind and its replacement by new powers in the Mediterranean world, such as the Germanic tribes who arrived into Europe and the Arabs who conquered the Middle East and North Africa in the 7th and 8th centuries BC. There are also extensive commentaries on the nature of gender politics within the books, with the female Bene Gesserit acting as a sage group of women who were concerned at the long-term preservation of the universe and humanity, while the Fremen are a largely egalitarian society from a gender perspective. These may seem like conventional ideas today, but they weren't when Herbert was writing in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Finally, there are all manner of coded themes within the book, from the spice melange being an analogy for the seeming growing dependence on the Western world on oil-producing countries in the Middle East in Herbert's time, to veiled criticisms of the growing overpopulation of the planet, which was already a major concern for many thinkers in the 1960s. The world of Dune is also one which interweaves a great array of historical references. Arrakis itself can be read as an analogy to the Middle East, with the Fremen effectively being the Bedouin tribes which populated the Arabian Peninsula for centuries and who eventually allied with the British to overthrow the Ottoman Turkish rule during the First World War. For the spice mélange, one need only read the word oil in some senses, while the reference to Paul Atreides as a kind of messiah named Muad'Dib was perhaps a thinly veiled allusion by Herbert to the Mahdi leader of the revolt against British rule in the Sudan in the 1880s and 1890s. There is even reference to the Fremen engaging in jihad or holy war, but all of this is not to suggest that Herbert was trying to write some parable about Western interference in the Muslim world. He simply borrowed from such contemporary political concerns. Other aspects of the world are taken from elsewhere. Perhaps the portrayal of the Atreides and Harkonnen was grounded on English and French rivalry and tensions over the centuries, while the picture presented of how both houses functioned is resoundingly feudal and medieval. Finally, there are historical references sprinkled throughout the book, and there are numerous clever literary allusions. The Tleilaxu are a societal group that become more and more important to the world of Dune throughout Herbert's novels. The name itself is a close allusion to groups like the Tlaxcala, who were the primary rivals of the Aztecs amongst the Nahuatl-speaking people of Central America before the Spanish arrived on the scene and conquered all of them in the early 16th century. While Herbert did continue to work as a journalist and environmentalist following the initial publication of Dune, the book's critical success and the winning of both the Hugo and Nebula Awards in 1966 led to growing sales of the book, which had been critically celebrated, but which did not translate into instant financial success. For instance, by 1968, Herbert had only made $20,000 from sales of the book, not an insignificant amount by the standards of the late 1960s, but certainly not a huge sum either, given its success and what authors of such works could have hoped to make back in the 1960s. This was, in part, because his deal with Chiltern was not advantageous to Herbert, and he had only agreed to it on the back of having the book rejected by so many other publishers. With a wife and young family, it was not enough for Herbert to commit himself to writing 100% of the time, but the book's success did open up other opportunities for Herbert career-wise and financially as a lecturer and author on other topics. Thus, while Dune's commercial success was a slow burner, which would really only take off in the 1970s and 1980s, the book did allow him enough leeway to begin committing more and more time to writing. He would become more productive in the course of the late 1960s, 1970s, and early 1980s. The first result of all of this was the preparation in the late 1960s of the sequel to Dune for publication. Entitled Dune Messiah, it was originally published in serial form in Galaxy magazine, and then as a standalone novel by Putnam in late 1969. Both it and Herbert's third novel in the series, Children of Dune, was substantially written in the 1960s, with lengthy drafts prepared before Dune itself was ever published. Dune Messiah was a considerably shorter work than Dune, running to about 200 pages in most modern paperback editions. It continues the story of Paul Atreides, picking up 12 years after the events which occurred at the end of Dune. Paul rules as Emperor of the universe, but he is an unconventional one. More dramatically, his conquest of Arrakis and the rise of the Fremen has set off a galactic jihad or holy war which has spread to countless planets and star systems and led to the deaths of billions of people. In this, Herbert was influenced by the historic events which had followed the rise of Islam in the Arabian desert under the Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century AD, and the subsequent Arab conquests which had seen the Bedouin people, a clear analogue for the Fremen, spread out across the Middle East and North Africa, eventually conquering a vast region from Spain in the west to Pakistan in the east, and from the Caucasus south into the Sahara Desert. Yet, as bloody as both the Arab conquests and the Fremen jihad were, the idea is meant to be that both will bring a universal peace once the known world or universe is united under the same religious and philosophical maxims. Thus, while Herbert has Paul deeply regret the jihad he has created, he also emphasizes that Paul sees the ultimate goal of it all. Despite this, Paul is a tortured figure in Dune Messiah. He is surrounded with plots by agents such as the Bene Gesserit and the Tleilaxu to assassinate him or remove him from power. Eventually, these culminate in Paul being blinded during the use of a Tleilaxu nuclear weapon. This creates a quandary amongst the Fremen, who are of the view that any Fremen who is blinded must walk out into the desert alone, effectively committing suicide, as, without the ability to see, he or she becomes a burden on the community. Yet, Paul stuns everyone by revealing that the spice melange now allows him to see even without the use of his eyes. Such is the level of his prescience. Nevertheless, as the plots mount and the scheming becomes ever greater, Paul ultimately decides to abdicate in favor of his twin children, Leto and Hanima. He then walks out into the desert, seemingly to meet his death at the end of the novel. Dune Messiah was ultimately a more meditative book with less action than the original Dune. In it, Herbert was keen to emphasize more the philosophical elements of the world he had created and to explore a number of moral themes through Paul's ethical and psychological turmoil. Who was the man who was developing this sandy world with its complex technology and serious moral and philosophical questions? Herbert was something of an enigma. On the one hand, he was an early version of the West Coast libertine, an individual who grew his beard out before it became fashionable, who experimented with marijuana and psilocybin when many people across America barely knew what these things were, and who was vastly concerned with ecological and environmental matters. As he grew older, he also became interested in issues surrounding sustainable archaeology and how home building could integrate elements of the natural environment. He was surprisingly progressive in all these pursuits, elements of his personality which were driven by his boundless curiosity, a trait which also led to his interests in things like photography, gardening, horticulture, and eventually the technology of computers. But there was another side to Herbert which was decidedly less appealing to modern audiences. He was an authoritarian father, one who used corporal punishment on his sons. This was perhaps not uncommon by the standards of the 1950s and 1960s, but his use of a US Navy lie detector test to question them when he believed they were deceiving was decidedly more unusual. He was also known to lock the children out of their home when Beverly wasn't there so that he could concentrate on his writing. But the most difficult element of his family life was unquestionably his relationship with his younger son Bruce, who was gay and who clashed repeatedly with Frank about this. He did not disown him, but in the end Bruce largely sundered contact with Frank as he became frustrated with his father's incessant claims that Bruce had chosen his sexual orientation and needed to return to heterosexuality. It placed a strain on the Herberts' family life over decades, though Brian, the older son, later stated that he had forgiven his father and come to admire him. Herbert's politics have been a matter of considerable speculation, although this is itself somewhat peculiar because they seem relatively straightforward and opaque. He was unquestionably a conservative and a firm defender of American values during the hottest period of the Cold War in the 1950s and 1960s. Indeed, one could in many ways read the House of Atreides in the world of Dune as being analogous to the United States and the Harkonnen being an analogue for the Soviet Union. But Herbert's values in this respect went beyond the commonplace support for the United States. Herbert was a fairly fervent supporter of Senator Joseph McCarthy and the communist witch hunts which took place during the Red Scare of the 1950s. McCarthy was a distant relative who Herbert affectionately referred to as Cousin Joe. Moreover, Herbert earned part of his living in the 1950s by acting as a speechwriter for Guy Cordon, a district attorney for South Oregon, who subsequently served as one of the senators for the state between 1944 and 1955. Cordon has been deemed the last conservative senator to serve in the state. More broadly, Herbert became a growing believer in the idea of a slimmed-down, small federal government which did not overtly interfere in the lives of citizens and which, if Herbert's troubled tax affairs over many years is anything to judge by, did not impose high taxes on people. Perhaps why people have found Herbert's political views hard to understand is that these stances on small government, taxation, US attitudes towards the Soviet Union, and the labor and communist movement within the US contrast so sharply with Herbert's other political and personal stances, not to mention his precocious affinity for psychotropic drugs and elements of what would later be simplistically derided as beatnik culture. While his views on small government, taxation and foreign policy would fit quite smoothly with the Republican Party throughout much of its modern history, Herbert's environmentalism and ecological stances certainly do not correspond with many in the modern American conservative movement, particularly compared to the modern progressive movement. Because of this, there are seemingly many clear contradictions in Herbert's political views. But it is worth remembering that the Republican Party, which he supported in the 1950s, was a very different party to that which Ronald Reagan reshaped in the 1980s, and certainly that of the early 21st century. Herbert was ultimately closer to the Republican Party of figures like Ulysses S. Grant, who began the process of ecological preservation in the 19th century through the formation of Yellowstone National Park. If we were to define Herbert's political stances in modern terms, he probably could be viewed most accurately as a libertarian rather than an adherent to any of the two major parties in the United States. Despite the success of Dune and then Dune Messiah, Herbert continued to work in other fields into the 1970s. Although he finally quit his job as a journalist in 1971 and would never return to newspapers thereafter, he replaced this activity with work elsewhere, teaching a course, for example, on creative writing and science fiction at the University of Washington, which he called Utopia Dystopia. He also continued his interest in a wide range of ecological projects. For instance, he and Beverly purchased a property in Port Townsend in Washington state, which they named Xanadu. Here, they began developing what were radical environmental projects by the standards of the 1970s and which were well ahead of their time. For instance, a swimming pool was installed, one which was heated using solar panels installed on the roof of the house. A poultry house was also installed, one which was heated by using the methane from the bird droppings. He also visited countries such as Vietnam and Pakistan to consult with government bodies on various ecological projects, while he was in high demand as a reviewer by publication houses which published science fiction or fantasy novels. Herbert, for example, was instrumental in launching the career of Terry Brooks, one of the foremost fantasy writers of the last quarter of the 20th century. Herbert was also writing other works during these years. Though he is primarily remembered today for his work on Dune and its numerous sequels, he wrote dozens of short stories, numerous novellas, and even entire series of books based in different worlds to the one he had created for Dune. For instance, between the mid-1960s and early 1980s, he wrote 4 books in the Worship or Pandora series, which begins with Destination Void, a book which returns to Herbert's concern about the prospect of artificial intelligence being developed. This series is based on Earth. However, in this series, the narrative shows AI having once been developed in Washington state with disastrous consequences for humanity. In the series, following the disaster of AI, experiments were being conducted on the moon to avoid AI fighting humanity. There are also other themes within the series, such as the issue of human or mammal cloning. Again, all scientific ethical issues which would become concerns of human society decades after Herbert first wrote about them. Nor was the Pandora series the limit of Herbert's non-Dune productivity. He wrote well over a dozen standalone novellas, several of which remained unpublished during his lifetime, but others, such as the Santaroga Barrier, were published and well enough received for their exploration of the concepts of utopia and philosophical concerns. The last decade of Herbert's life was, in many ways, the most productive of all. In 1976, the third novel in the Dune series appeared. Children of Dune begins 9 years after the events of Dune Messiah. Arrakis has been transformed into a livable planet where green vistas are able to support Fremen villages and even towns, a device which allows Herbert to expand on the ecological ideas which he first presented back in the 1960s. However, all is not well amongst the Atreides. Paul's sister, Alia, is effectively acting as regent for her young niece and nephew, Paul's children, Leto and Hanima, but she is succumbing to a process called abomination, whereby the spirit of the old Baron Harkonnen is taking over her mind. At the same time, a mysterious figure, known at the start only as the Preacher, has appeared out of the desert and has gained notoriety amongst the Fremen. Over time, it is revealed that this is actually Paul Atreides, and that he has somehow survived for years out in the desert. Extensive political machinations occur in what was the lengthiest book yet in the series, eventually resulting in Leto's ascendancy as emperor. It was nominated for a Hugo Award, but did not win it. The fourth book in the series, God Emperor of Dune, which was first published in 1981, was the most dramatic departure for Herbert and his writing style. It was the first Dune novel to not focus on the character of Paul Atreides, but rather focused on his son and successor Emperor Leto as its principal character. The novel is set 3,500 years after the events of Children of Dune. Leto has transformed into a hybrid of a human and a giant sandworm and rules as a tyrant over the universe. Arrakis itself has been completely terraformed into a green planet. The greening of Dune led to the death of the other sandworms which produce the spice mélange. Accordingly, Leto has become the only producer of the vital substance and holds godlike powers owing to his ability to control the last remaining supply of the product. He has rendered the people of the universe into an almost infantile position, limiting their technology and ability to space travel, while the Fremen are a broken people who have given up their warlike ways. As it proceeds, we learn that new groups, such as the Ixians, are working on alternative methods of space travel in response to Leto's tyranny. Overall, the book was a meditation on the cyclical nature of history and how revolutions give way to tyranny, only to be followed by subsequent revolutions. God Emperor of Dune was followed in 1984 by Heretics of Dune. This is set a millennium and a half after the events of the previous novel, a time in which humanity has scattered to the furthest reaches of the universe. It focuses primarily on the Bene Gesserit and their efforts to perceive the Golden Path, a plan devised by the long-deceased Emperor Leto to save humanity from destruction. This plan was created in the wake of the return of some human groups from the scattered universe towards the older systems bent on conquest. As things evolve, the Bene Gesserit determined to destroy Arrakis, renamed Arrakis since it was terraformed, and to bring a sandworm to their planet Chapter House, where they will transform it into a sand trout and terraform the planet to become like Arrakis was in the days of Paul Atreides. This story is then directly picked up in the sixth and last book written by Herbert, Chapter House Dune. However, the grand story arc would ultimately be left incomplete due to Herbert's death. Herbert had been working on a seventh book, which would complete the story of the Bene Gesserit and others on Chapter House at the time of his death. He left copious notes, which his son, Brian, later used in conjunction with Kevin J. Anderson to attempt to produce sequels based on Frank's notes and ideas. That Frank was unable to complete the books he had planned was, in some ways, owing to his personal circumstances in the early 1980s. Beverly had been diagnosed with lung cancer in 1980, a virtual death sentence in an age of limited forms of treatment. While there was no hope of curing her, they did try to prolong her life by largely relocating to Hawaii, hoping that the warmer climate and drier air might do her lungs some good. Here, they built an elaborate house replete with a swimming pool and other amenities, secure financially for the first time in their lives, as Frank continued to earn more and more from book royalties and also payments for selling the film licenses to Dune. The fourth and fifth installments in the book series also earned Herbert large advances. Thus, he was able to spend much of his time either writing or caring for Beverly. She died in 1984, following which Frank married for a third and final time in 1985, this time to Teresa Shackelford, a representative from his publisher, the Putnam Press. It would be a brief but happy final marriage. Herbert did not survive Beverly for long, but his last years were certainly ones of activity. His son, Brian, took over some of the bookkeeping work Beverly had performed on the Herbert's finances in 1984, and soon discovered that Frank had accumulated large debts on his construction projects and owed the IRS a substantial amount of money in unpaid taxes. Unperturbed, Frank carried on with expanding the building work in Hawaii by adding a waterfall and a carp pond. He was also planning the construction of a new house on the Herbert property at Port Townsend in Washington state for his daughter from his first marriage, Penny, and her husband, who were caretakers there when Frank was absent. More ambitiously, he was planning a trek to Nepal in his mid-60s with a friend, Jim Whittaker, during which they also planned to cross into Tibet so that Herbert could become the oldest man to reach the summit of Mount Everest, a feat Whittaker had managed already himself years earlier. But these dreams would not be realized. In November 1985, he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, an illness which remains one of the most incurable types of cancer even 40 years later. Experimental treatment and surgery followed at the University of Wisconsin in Madison to allay a disease which had an average life expectancy of less than 6 months after diagnosis. It was there that he passed away after suffering a pulmonary embolism on the 11th of February 1986 at 65 years of age. Even before his death, there were concerted efforts underway to adapt Dune into a motion picture. The first of these was commenced in the 1970s by the Chilean-French director Alejandro Jodorowsky. Much of his previous work focused on elements of mysticism, religion, and philosophy, and so Dune was an intriguing topic to take on. A French consortium bought the rights to the film from Herbert in 1974, and Jodorowsky began work on a production. Early signs were promising and intriguing. A large budget of $10 million was provided, and Jodorowsky managed to convince the Spanish-French actor and dilettante Salvador Dali to play the role of the Emperor, while the acclaimed American director Orson Welles was to feature as the Baron Harkonnen, and a role was envisaged for Mick Jagger of the Rolling Stones. Bizarrely, Dali agreed only on the condition that it would be a piece of performative art, being paid $100,000 per hour of filming and becoming the highest-paid actor in motion picture history in the process, terms to which Jodorowsky agreed, planning to cut Dali's time on set to 1 hour in order to afford him. Dali also insisted that his throne on set was to be comprised of a toilet seat and 2 intersecting dolphins at the back. Jodorowsky's vision soon became too convoluted, and it was not just from Dali's excessive demands. By 1976, the director was planning a 14-hour-long movie, one which caused Herbert concern, as Jodorowsky was also planning on departing too far from the source material. In the end, Jodorowsky's Dune was never made, though an American-French-produced documentary on the project and Jodorowsky's efforts to produce the film, one which was very well received, was released in 2013. However, in the 1970s, the rights to the film were ultimately sold to the American surrealist filmmaker David Lynch, who, in the end, produced a film in 1984 starring Kyle MacLachlan as Paul Atreides and the singer Sting as Fade Ratha, the Baron Harkonnen's nephew. The film was a box office bomb, having been produced on a very large budget and was critically derided, although it did subsequently develop a cult following based largely on how bad some of the set pieces and set design are. Lynch subsequently disowned the film, claiming the final cuts were not his own. Nor was the world which Herbert created abandoned with his own passing. Prior to his father's death, one of Herbert's children, Brian Herbert, had become an emerging author himself, typically writing science fiction. Then, beginning in the mid-1990s, he began work on what would eventually become a prequel trilogy to Dune itself, with 3 novels entitled Dune, House Atreides, Dune, House Harkonnen, and Dune, House Corino, exploring the rise of the two rival houses and that of the imperial House Corino. It was the beginning of Brian's extension of the Dune universe, and in total he has produced nearly 24 Dune books since the numerous short stories. Nor was Brian Herbert alone in this. As rights were extended to other authors, numerous other books on the Dune universe began to appear in the 1990s, 2000s, and 2010s. For instance, in 1999, Joseph M. Daniels published The Stars and Planets of Frank Herbert's Dune, a gazetteer, which sought to explore the physical realities of Herbert's invented universe in a way which Herbert had only ever really alluded to in his novels. Nor is the Dune universe exclusive to published books. Several successful video games have appeared as part of the franchise, notably Dune 2: The Battle for Arrakis, a strategy simulator released in 1992, which became one of the most successful video games of its era. Tabletop games have also been developed. More strikingly, many of the geographical features on the moon Titan, which orbits the planet Saturn in our solar system, have been named in recent decades after geographical places named in the Dune novels. Therefore, Herbert's legacy now extends to space itself. There have also been renewed efforts to film Dune after the abortive efforts of Jodorowsky in the 1970s and the lackluster final product which Lynch ended up with in the 1980s. The Sci-Fi Channel produced a series of mini-series in the early 2000s based on the first 3 novels in the saga. However, the foremost endeavour in this respect is the trilogy of films which the Canadian director Denis Villeneuve is creating. One of these, based on the first half of Dune, has already appeared in cinemas in 2021 and was considered a vast improvement on earlier versions. Thus, Herbert's world and vision is alive and well. Herbert's legacy is immense today, particularly in the realm of science fiction writing, although, curiously, he divides opinion amongst many science fiction enthusiasts, many of whom find his prose plodding and difficult, while others consider him one of the greatest science fiction writers of all time. This is entirely owing to Dune and the world in which it is set, as well as some of the sequel novels. Science fiction, at its best, is considered to be a medium for exploring issues which confront humanity in the here and now, or which will do so in decades to come. In this respect, Dune and its sequels were prescient. For instance, Herbert portrayed a world in which advanced types of technology, and in particular artificial intelligence, were almost entirely prohibited for widespread use on the basis of how much damage they could inflict upon society if unregulated. In this respect, Herbert has never been more relevant than in the early 2020s. But his books, with their emphasis on environmentalism and ecological disaster and their discussion of power relations between states, or houses in the case of Dune, are also enormously relevant. Herbert was writing about many of the issues which would come to define the late 20th and early 21st centuries decades before they ever entered mainstream consciousness. This perhaps explains why Dune's popularity was such a slow build. It sold well in the 1960s and 1970s, but really it was from the 1980s, as issues around climate change and the post-Cold War world order came into vogue, that it became hugely successful. Thus, Herbert was something of a prophet of the future, and this has provided the basis for the enduring popularity of all things Arrakis and the world he created. What do you think of Frank Herbert? Was he the greatest science fiction writer of all time, and were his ecological ideas as presented in Dune prescient of the problems which humanity faces in the 21st century? Please, let us know in the comments section, and in the meantime, Thank you very much for watching.